Welcome to the recording of Improving Student Success through Implementation of the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Goals. I'm Lindsay Engstrom, co-designer and facilitator of the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Network and staff member at the Central Regional Education Association. As original project coordinators, Keely Irie of the Southeast Education Cooperative and I are excited to share this recording with you. It is our intended outcomes that, as a result of reviewing this recorded session, you'll be able to identify the 5 competencies of social emotional learning as defined by CASEL, understand the purpose of the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Goals, understand how to access the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Goals, and apply a process, or at least a part of a process, for implementing the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Goals into current practice. While this is not a session about social emotional learning directly, it is a session designed to acclimate you to a resource that can support social emotional learning. Specifically, the explicit instruction of social emotional learning in your classroom, throughout your school or school district. This resource, the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Goals, is foundational or can be foundational to all social emotional work within a school environment. In order to understand how to access the purpose of and how to implement the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Goals, we must have some collective context and understanding as to the underpinning for the goals themselves. Common terminology seems like the best place to begin today. In October of 2020, the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, CASEL, which is a trusted resource for knowledge about high-quality, evidence-based social emotional learning and partner to the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Leadership Team, subtly revised their definition of SEL to read: the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. The North Dakota Social Emotional Leadership Team has identified keywords that are color-coded within this definition. And as you can see, CASEL developed such a meaningful definition that it was difficult to determine words that were not key. Let's begin with the word process. The word process implies continual, never complete. This is certainly the case with social emotional learning skill acquisition. It is a continually evolving process. It ebbs and flows, and we always have the opportunity to reinforce our skills. So do our students, regardless of their age. How lucky North Dakota students are to have educators like you to give them the opportunity to practice their skills and prepare for life after K-12. This next phrase, young people and adults. As mentioned, the process of social emotional skill acquisition and application doesn't end, and it certainly doesn't end by graduating high school. It occurs throughout a lifespan. We hear the phrase adult SEL a lot these days. The North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Leadership Team encourages you to get really curious when you hear that phrase, adult SEL. Within the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Network, an established community of practice for school leadership teams, we think of adult SEL within 2 prongs. The first, growing our personal competencies and modeling those competencies as we work with each other, with our students, and with their families. As it turns out, our personal competencies are imperative, not only to our employment, but also to our effectiveness in the classroom. The second prong to adult SEL is capacity, which means the ability of us as adult models, as school personnel, to assist our students in growing their competencies. As you can see, young people and adults, process is complex. Acquiring and applying the next keywords within the definition imply a balance between instruction and practice opportunities. And within these practice opportunities, the opportunity to make and correct mistakes is vitally important. The next phrase, knowledge, skills, and attitudes. As educators, as school personnel, we know that it isn't just about knowing. It's about being able to translate the knowing to doing, and also being willing to know and do. The final color-coded piece of this definition, develop healthy identities. If we've had any exposure to the CASEL competencies to date, hopefully we would think self-awareness, manage emotions and achieve personal and collective goals. We would think self-management. Establish and maintain supportive relationships. We think relationship skills. Feel and show empathy for others. We think social awareness. Make responsible and caring decisions. We think responsible decision making. This final piece of the definition rounds out the 5 SEL competencies as defined by CASEL. CASEL took that big and somewhat cumbersome definition loaded full of impactful, meaningful words and put it into a framework represented by this picture. Please pause this recording and take a moment to study, review the framework, and note anything that you see. As you review these noticings, please locate the Jam board for this session located at tinyurl.com/ND SEL Jam, and make note of anything that you notice or that comes to you as you're reviewing this model. An example, make sure that you're on frame 1 of the Jam board, but your examples of noticings could be very general. For example, the 5 CASEL competencies. Or could be more specific, like the blue rings and how they're different from the 2017 model. Take a moment to pause. As we're back, I will point out those 2 noticings, the 5 competencies as noted by CASEL. The CASEL 5 addresses broad yet interrelated areas of competence. The CASEL 5 can be taught and applied at various developmental stages from childhood to adulthood and across diverse cultural contexts. Many school districts, states, and even countries have used the CASEL 5 to establish pre-K through high school learning standards. The North Dakota context, of course, is that those competencies were used to establish the North Dakota social emotional learning goals. And these goals articulate what students should know and be able to do for academic success, for school and civic engagement, for health and wellness, and for fulfilling careers. Additionally, a point to note within this CASEL framework are the blue rings, as we mentioned. This is what we'll refer to as key settings. CASEL's framework takes a systemic approach that emphasizes the importance of establishing an equitable learning environment and coordinating practices across key settings, from classrooms to school-wide environments, even into homes and communities, in order to enhance students' social, emotional, and academic learning. Students, families, schools, and communities are all a part of broader systems that help shape learning, development, and experiences. In addition to the framework, CASEL has included a more elaborate definition of each competency, as well as associated skills or indicators. Please pause this recording to retrieve this document, which is available using the tiny URL at the left side of your screen. The North Dakota Social Emotional Goals writing team ensured strong alignment with the CASEL framework by explicitly aligning the learning goals to competencies as well as indicators that were just referenced. The North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Goals are available in two formats: by grade span, K2, 3-5, 6-8, and 9-12, but also by competency: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. Please pause this recording to locate both versions of the learning goals. The learning goals can be accessed by using the tiny URL at the top of your screen. Now that you have located the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Goals, let's take a look at a couple of document components that will allow you to maximize your use of the goals and the documents themselves. First, as previously stated, the writing team adopted the CASEL competencies, which are consistently defined and color-coded, orange, blue, or yellow, throughout both sets of documents. We also adopted the 2017 version of the indicators of each competency as skills that are foundational for each learning. Each indicator has a code that is found in a black box. These codes are introduced within the initial pages of each version of the Learning Goals document. Finally, each goal contains at least one verb, which is bolded and underlined within the listing of goals themselves. When you see these verbs, you can automatically think Bloom's taxonomy. As mentioned, the learning goals were written in 2017, so the definitions and indicators that they were established based on the information available at that time. Because CASEL has updated definitions and indicators in October of 2020, the leadership team is currently contemplating actively making changes to these North Dakota generated resources and tools. Let's take our explanation of document components for a test drive. Please pause to locate the answer to the following question. Question number 1 of our scavenger hunt. The indicator ASP can be found in the self-awareness competency. What does ASP stand for? Pause. If you found the indicator ASP to mean or represent accurate self-perception, you're correct. Question number 2 of 3 of our document scavenger hunt. In the 3 through 5 grade span, in the social awareness competency, what is the learning goal associated with the indicator E/PT? Pause. If you answered, describe the feelings and perspective of others, you are correct. The final and third question within our scavenger hunt is, at what grade level do you find the following goal? Analyze how current choices affect one's future. Pause. If you answered the 9 through 12 grade span, you are correct. Now that you understand how to access the learning goals and the components of each of the documents, let's discuss how you might use those goals. In order to support systemic implementation of social emotional learning, our North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Leadership Team has adopted 3 assumptions about SEL. Each assumption aligns with or relates to a blue ring within the CASEL framework, known as the key settings. The first assumption is social emotional skills are learned, therefore they must be taught. This assumption aligns with the innermost ring, the key setting known as classrooms. One purpose of the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Goals is to guide explicit instruction of social and emotional learning skills. The developed learning goals provide reasonable expectations for what North Dakota students should know and be able to do by the end of each grade span. Most North Dakota school districts have already adopted North Dakota content standards for core academic instructional areas. In the absence of SEL standards, the North Dakota SEL goals can guide explicit instruction of social emotional skills by providing a comprehensive, developmentally appropriate learning progression specific to SEL. The North Dakota SEL goals can establish common terminology in the area of SEL that may be less familiar to district personnel, caregivers, even students themselves. Adopting the North Dakota SEL goals or equivalent can communicate that SEL is a priority and establish social emotional learning as an area that merits instructional focus. The SEL goals articulate what students should know and be able to do as it relates to SEL from grades kindergarten through grade 12. These goals can serve as an anchor for SEL within North Dakota schools. Examples of extended work might include, but are certainly not limited to, selecting curriculum resources that guide explicit instruction, or outlining the intersection of social emotional learning with standards in academic content areas to look for opportunities for integration into core curricula. The second assumption is that social emotional learning is for all students. Therefore, all educators must contribute to the process of acquiring and reinforcing social emotional knowledge and skills. This assumption aligns to the key setting of schools, the second most ring, which includes that innermost ring of classrooms and explicit instruction, which was disclosed as a part of assumption number 1. Another purpose for this SEL goals is to serve as an anchor for professional learning. The North Dakota social emotional goals are freestanding. That presents both a barrier and an opportunity. For example, in some spaces, social emotional learning might be seen as solely the school counselor's job. While school counselors are certainly leaders in this work by nature, one person or one role within the school building cannot support the social emotional skill acquisition, provide adequate practice opportunities, and reinforce knowledge and skills exclusively. This assumption clearly states that SEL is a team sport, and all members of the team, meaning all school personnel, have an active role in this process. Herein lies the opportunity. The third assumption, the needs of today's students and families are complex. Therefore, integration and implementation of multiple yet aligned strategies, programs, and practices and processes is warranted. This assumption aligns to the key settings of homes and communities, the outermost rings, in which schools and school personnel have a profound influence. The North Dakota SEL goals can serve as a foundational tool to support matching the needs of students and families of the diverse population within North Dakota and serving those needs with matched or aligned support. Yet another purpose of the SEL goals is to guide selection of evidence-based programs and solicit aligned learning opportunities. In addition to describing the purpose of the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Goals, it's also important to state what the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Goals were not meant to be. Some non-examples include the SEL goals were not meant exclusively for school counselors. Rather, they are freestanding guidelines for all school personnel. The North Dakota SEL goals are not a checklist. Rather, they are a framework for what students should know and be able to do within or by the end of each grade span. The SEL goals are not a curriculum. Rather, they are a tool to guide selection of curriculum resources. The North Dakota SEL goals are not a one-size-fits-all strategy, practice, approach, or program. Rather, a tool to guide instruction, skill acquisition that builds upon previous grade spans and helps us identify those strategies, practices, approaches, and programs. Implementation of the goals can and should look different across North Dakota. You may be wondering, how were the goals developed or created? We would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge and properly thank the writing team, as well as the North Dakota school districts who supported the time of those writers to do this important work. Thank you to both the writing team and the cooperating school districts. The North Dakota SEL leadership team initiated the work of the North Dakota goal development in August of 2017, when representatives from a variety of North Dakota districts from various geographic locations, school district enrollment, and positions within education convened in Jamestown, North Dakota. All told, a group of 26 educators, including teachers, administrators, social workers, school counselors, and even district office personnel from 10 districts, 2 special education units, 1 community agency, 2 Department of Public Instruction offices, and 2 regional education associations met for the purpose of achieving 3 goals. The first was to understand CASEL's 5 competencies as it relates to social emotional learning. The second was to evaluate previously established freestanding learning goals and developmental benchmarks from across the country. And the third was to develop freestanding social emotional learning goals as a guide for North Dakota K-12 educators. The team then embarked upon an extensive revision process, including submission of the learning goals to CASEL for review. The initial product was revised and released as an open source resource at the NDMTSS conference in June of 2018. Our leadership team continues to accept feedback from practitioners and contemplates revisions to the learning goals. So how can these goals be implemented? How might we move from what we are, current state, to what we may want to be, desired state? The North Dakota SEL leadership team would like to provide a suggestion as to how to get started with implementation. We know that school personnel from a variety of roles within the school district are likely reviewing this recording, and that's great because it might be our job to invest in the process. It might be our job to support the process, meaning create the conditions in order for it to occur and occur effectively and maximize the output. Please note, implementing the North Dakota social emotional learning goals, like implementing many best practice strategies in education, is a process of continuous improvement. You might find yourself at a variety of stages within this continuous improvement cycle today and in the future. This suggested implementation strategy that we provide today is simply a suggestion, it's simply a start, and it really serves as a needs assessment. To start, we suggest an instructional resource scan, including your primary curriculum resource. You might begin by selecting a grade span. Next, you might reflect and evaluate on the learning goals included within that grade span. You might select 2 marks, the ones on the screen, a plus or a minus, or your own, and mark each goal within that grade span as this goal receives adequate instructional focus. That might be in time, that might be in resource, The other symbol stands for this goal does not receive instruction or adequate instructional focus. Then you might compare your instructional resource scan with that of your grade level counterparts, if applicable. You might even choose to collaborate with grade span peers to determine what their resource scans look like. Classroom teachers, pro tip, be sure to review the learning goals of the grade span before yours to know how the educational experience was intended to prepare your incoming students. But also be sure to review the grade span that comes after yours so you know and know well how you are intending to prepare your students. Making a simple chart like the one pictured on your screen might help you assist in researching supplementary resources to address specific learning goals that do not allow for adequate instructional time or resource as a focus, or communicating your resource needs. An extension of this exercise might be to create or evaluate an existing pacing guide if one is already in place, ensuring that each goal is being addressed and when it's being addressed, inclusive of which grade band and in which time period, so semester, trimester, quarter, however your school year is organized by time. At this time, we invite you once again to pause this recording, visit our session Jamboard, tinyurl.com/ND SEL Jam, visit frame 2, and just tell us something about what your instructional resource scan told you or disclosed. Again, your comments might be very general, or they could certainly be specific. We also invite you at this time to contribute any learnings, wonderings, or suggestions as it relates to the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Goals within our Jamboard. The Jamboard will remain open if your resource scan information is not available here at this time during your initial recording. An educational leader once said, "Teaching kids is our passion and getting better at it is our job." Serving the ever-changing needs of our students is challenging and takes a continual effort in order to get better. The most effective professional development is job embedded and ongoing. This session is neither of those things unless you allow it to be. Please consider taking the conversations that we intended to start here with you today beyond the 4 walls that you're currently sitting in. On behalf of the North Dakota Social Emotional Learning Leadership Team, I thank you for reviewing this recording as evidence to your commitment to North Dakota students.